Everyone, please find their seat. We're going to get the program started in just a moment. Please find a seat. If everyone could please find a seat. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great honor and privilege to welcome you to the last of our lecture programs in 2023. We've had over 24 programs throughout the year on a variety of topics. I think they've all been fantastic. They've been attended with great enthusiasm and numbers by our members and guests and others. And I thank you for being at these programs. They are just a small part of what we do, a very small part. What we do is we fight for those same values that Lincoln, Douglass, and the Union League did 160 years ago. And we do that through education, civics education, scholarships, and through promoting the values that are in that first line of your bylaws. Every member shall support the Constitution of the United States. And as we reach the end of the year, I want to thank all those that support our work through a contribution to the Legacy Foundation. My great thanks. We don't do anything without your support. It's entirely through your voluntary support. And don't worry if you haven't made a gift yet this year. There's still a couple weeks left, and we would greatly appreciate your support. And if you haven't given yet, I'm sure you're going to hear from Kristen Moran and our development team. So I thank you in advance for your support. A few housekeeping items tonight. First of all, you would silence your cell phones. And I will take a moment while you do that. We will have Q&A at the end of the program. Please use the microphone. We are streaming live, and we want to hear your questions. And as always, questions should be in the form of a question. And just a couple sentences. Our crack AV team knows the sign. So let's continue our good work with great questions and short questions. Also, we have our spring program, our winter spring program is just about set. We'll be publishing it, I hope, in the next couple of weeks. But I do want to mention just the first one in January, which is another Civil War roundtable with Alan Gelzo, A War for the World, the Civil War and its Place in World History. And we're going to have a special unveiling of a new piece to our collection, which is really exciting. So we hope you'll be there. It's on January 17th. You should be able to register online, if not today, very, very soon. January 17th, Alan Gelzo. And without further ado, it's my great honor to introduce the chair of the Union League Legacy Foundation, who will introduce our speaker, Mr. Jim Dunnigan. Jim.
Thank you, John. Good evening, everyone. And thank you, John, for covering the solicitation part of the program. I appreciate that. And I do appreciate everyone who has provided their support. It is my pleasure this evening to introduce our speaker, Professor Robert R. Levine. Professor Levine is a distinguished university professor of English at the University of Maryland, College Park. He has wide interests in 19th century American literature and culture, and a particular fascination with the life and work of Frederick Douglass. He has written several books, and his op-eds and essays have appeared in Time, the Washington Post, Literary Imagination, and the Los Angeles Review of Books. Professor Levine is the general editor of the world's most widely used anthology of American literature, the Norton Anthology of American Literature. He has been awarded fellowships from NEH and the Guggenheim Foundation, and is currently working on a book about Harriet Beecher Stowe and the African America. His most recent book, The Failed Promise, Reconstruction, Frederick Douglass, and the Impeachment of Andrew Johnson, is the subject of his talk this evening. Please welcome Professor Robert Levine.
So thank you for the kind introduction. It's a real honor to speak at the Union League, the site of an inspiring painting of Frederick Douglass, and also a place that has a really great history that I learned about from Jim Mundy earlier today. I want to thank Herbert Hess for expressing interest in my Douglass and Johnson book and working to make this visit happen. My thanks as well to James Mundy. And for doing so much of the coordinating work, thank you, Kira Foley-Tusman. Finally, my thanks to the tech people who are helping out today. And my thanks to all of you for attending my presentation. As you'll see, I'm mainly going to talk about my most recent book, but I will say a few words about Douglass's last major speech, his 1894 anti-lynching speech called Lessons of the Hour. I was recently recruited to write an essay on that speech for an edited collection, so the speech is on my mind. And as you'll see, the speech can be thought of in relation to the topics I'll be addressing for my book. And let me just say that I'm older, I'm new to PowerPoint, and so you might have seen one of those pictures just moved without my even meaning to move it. So be patient with me, but I think I know how to do this. I have a little button here that I can play. Whoops. So let me just go back. Okay. So to turn to my most recent book, The Failed Promise, Reconstruction, Frederick Douglass, and the Impeachment of Andrew Johnson is the book's title. And the main title, The Failed Promise, gives you a sense of the large aims of a book that is mostly about the past, but also about the present. The very idea of a failed promise, after all, suggests that there is a promise still to be met. Hardly an isolated moment, Reconstruction has had consequences that we're continuing to live with as a nation. Like many historians, I think of Reconstruction as the period immediately after the Civil War, when the Republican Congress and Black activists were hopeful that the former Confederate states could be made over into places where ex-Confederate officers weren't in power and Black people had full rights as citizens. In some ways, these goals were achieved, but not without a fight against President Andrew Johnson, and much of the achievement was then undercut by the rise of Jim Crow segregation and the eventual lynching campaigns that were the focus of Douglass's 1894 speech, Lessons of the Hour. But to linger just a bit longer on the book's title, The Failed Promise also speaks to Andrew Johnson himself, who, as I'll be elaborating, initially seemed like he'd be a good Reconstruction president. But perhaps the key to the book's full title is the name Frederick Douglass. Typically, histories of Reconstruction and the Johnson impeachment focus on white radical Republican leaders like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens, with Douglass and other Black figures in the background. In my book, I foreground the cultural work of Black activists, thereby providing, for the first time, a Black perspective on the early years of Reconstruction, on Andrew Johnson, and on the impeachment itself. For Frederick Douglass and other Black activists, Reconstruction was about Blacks' rights to citizenship, and he and his associates fought for those rights. Today, I want to tell you what I call the Douglass-Johnson story, 1865 to 1868. This slide gives a synopsis of that story. So March 4th, and I'm going to be covering a lot of this. March 4th, 1865, Douglass and Johnson meet from a distance at Lincoln's second inauguration. April 15th, 1865, Johnson becomes the 17th president of the United States. Later that year, Douglass gives his first explicitly anti-Johnson speech. Early 1866, Douglass visits Johnson at the White House with the Black delegation arguing for Black rights. Summer of 1867, kind of amazing, I think, Andrew Johnson offers Douglass a job in his administration. Around the same time, Douglass is giving his most famous anti-Johnson speech, Sources of Danger to the Republic, which he actually gave in January 1867 in Philadelphia. February 1868 to May 1868, we have the impeachment of Johnson. Douglass's son Charles attends the trial, not Douglass. The Senate falls one vote short of conviction. Douglass does some additional writing about Johnson. So that's the outline of the story. Though Douglass did not participate in debates in Congress, he and many other Black activists spent 4 years engaging Johnson in a variety of ways. I now want to turn to Douglass's and Johnson's first meeting as a way of setting up my story. That meeting occurred on March 4th, 1865, the day of Lincoln's second inauguration. So this is a famous picture of Lincoln giving his "with malice toward none" speech on March 4th, 1865. I don't have a pointer, but my historian friends swear that Douglass is in the second row, kind of looking at Lincoln, but who knows? But Douglass was there. Lincoln invited Douglass to the inauguration because they had become friends of sorts, having twice met in the White House during the Civil War to talk about such things as equal pay for Black soldiers. But when Douglass tried to join the post-speech party in the White House, he was stopped by security guards who weren't expecting to see a Black man. People who knew Douglass got him admitted, and as soon as Lincoln saw Douglass, he walked over to him, declared to those nearby that Douglass was his friend, and asked Douglass how he liked the speech. Douglass called the speech, quote, "a sacred effort," end quote. And after Lincoln said how pleased he was, the president walked off to join Andrew Johnson, his vice president. Lincoln writes about what happened next. And this is from Douglass's 1881 Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, and it's significant that this was published long after this inauguration, as you'll see. So this is Douglass. "I was standing in the crowd when Mr. Lincoln touched Mr. Johnson and pointed me out to him. The first expression which came to his face, and which I think was the true index of his heart, was one of bitter contempt and aversion. Seeing that I observed him, he tried to assume a more friendly appearance, but it was too late. It is useless to close the door when all within has been seen." And I'm an English professor, and I love that metaphor. "His first glance was from the man. The second was the bland and sickly smile of the demagogue. I turned to Mrs. Jorsey, who is Douglass's Black friend, and said, 'Whatever Andrew Johnson may be, he certainly is no friend of our race.'" So Douglass wrote this account 16 years after the event. It's retrospective, and I don't think it's to be fully believed, because at that time, Johnson was regarded as progressive and even as a friend of Black people. The first U.S. president to face impeachment, Johnson was an up from the bootstraps, self-educated person who worked as a tailor, dabbled in real estate, and then got involved in Tennessee politics, gaining one of the state's 2 Senate seats in 1857 as a Democrat, not a Republican like Lincoln. As it turned out, Johnson was the only Southern senator who opposed the secession that followed on Lincoln's election in 1860. Lincoln appointed Johnson military governor of Tennessee in 1862, and in 1863, Johnson, a Southern Democrat, called for the abolition of slavery, which is kind of remarkable. Johnson was nominated to be vice president in 1864 when Republicans feared they would lose the election with Hannibal Hamlet of Maine as vice president. They wanted sectional and even political balance and found Johnson to be an appealing figure. Johnson became even more appealing in Republican and abolitionist circles when, in October 1864, while still military governor of Tennessee, he gave a famous speech in which he declared to hundreds, if not thousands, of African Americans at the state capitol that slavery was abolished in Tennessee. Tennessee was an occupied state, so it wasn't covered by the 1863 Emancipation Proclamation. Johnson's pronouncement in Nashville had no legal authority, but in some ways, the man who came to be regarded as incredibly racist while president did end slavery de facto in Tennessee by invoking his authority. Here's some snippets from a contemporary newspaper account of this moment. Near the outset of what came to be called his Moses of the Colored Men speech, Johnson announced the end of slavery in Tennessee and instructed Blacks that they needed to find a leader to help them with their freedom. In due time, Johnson says, your leader will come forth, your Moses will be revealed to you. End quote. According to the reporter on the scene, the large Black crowd responded as follows: "You are our Moses." And the exclamation was caught up and cheered until the Capitol rang again. "We want no Moses but you," again shouted the crowd. This is all from that newspaper account, which was widely circulated. Johnson's response: "Well then, humble and unworthy as I am, if no other better shall be found, I will indeed be your Moses and lead you through the Red Sea of war and bondage to a fairer future of liberty and peace." End of quotation, end of article. This speech made Johnson's reputation, at least temporarily. The newspaper article was reprinted in numerous other papers, including abolitionist newspapers. Johnson became obsessed with the speech over the next 6 years. Whenever anyone accused him of racism, he would remind his critics that the Blacks of Tennessee themselves had called him their Moses. So now I'm circling back to that inauguration moment. At the reception for Lincoln's second inaugural, about a year later or half year later, Douglass said he saw a racist. But I'm not sure if that's what he saw in March 1865 or when he was writing up his autobiography in 1881, long after Johnson's terrible presidency. The fact is that when Johnson took office on April 15th, 1865, some thought that he would be more progressive than Lincoln. Meanwhile, the Frederick Douglass who attended Lincoln's second inauguration had all along been fighting for Black emancipation and Black civil rights. That fight goes back to the 1840s when Douglass became an abolitionist working for William Lloyd Garrison. Douglass believed that the Civil War should be regarded not just as a war to preserve the Union, but as a war of emancipation. And during the war, he formulated his vision of Reconstruction, which I call the Douglass argument. In speeches delivered during the Civil War and in remarks he made virtually every day of the Johnson administration, Douglass again and again said something to this effect: slavery is not abolished until the Black man has the ballot. Douglass said these exact words at the May 1865 meeting of the American Anti-Slavery Society when, less than a month after Johnson became president, the white abolitionist leader, William Lloyd Garrison, called for the disbanding of the society because they had achieved their goal when the 13th Amendment had ended slavery in the United States. Douglass objected because Blacks did not yet have the suffrage, and Garrison's call to disband was put to a vote. Douglass's position won out, and Garrison subsequently resigned. The group stayed together until 1870, when the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote. But let's keep the focus for now on the spring of 1865, in the first few months after the end of the Civil War. When Johnson, on April 15th, 1865, assumed the presidency after the assassination of Lincoln, many Republicans thought they had a president prepared to move forward on Reconstruction. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, one of the most radical of the radical Republicans, confided to friends after meeting with the new president that he was so convinced that Johnson shared his views, that Johnson was the man, shared his views on Black suffrage, that he could comfortably say that, quote, the battle of his own life had ended, end quote. Other Republican leaders had similarly positive things to say about Johnson during the first few weeks of his presidency. But just 6 weeks after he took office, Johnson in late May issued an amnesty proclamation that essentially welcomed all the former Confederate states back into the Union on the condition that they accept the terms of the 13th Amendment. Otherwise, former Confederate officers could govern the states, and the ex-Confederate states could decide on their own what to do about the free people, including denying them their civil rights. This shocked Sumner and his fellow Republicans, who thought that a man who claimed to be a Moses of Black people would be willing to entertain a more thoroughgoing Reconstruction. Here's two of the leading radical Republicans, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts and Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Both men championed Black suffrage, and as I say, initially believed Johnson shared their views. Breaking from Johnson after the amnesty proclamation, Stevens, during the summer of 1865, argued, and this is his crucial argument, that the South had lost the war and therefore should be regarded as occupied territory, with the Northern victors deciding how to reconstruct the ex-Confederate states. President Johnson, by contrast, held firm to a bizarre belief that the Confederate states had never seceded because secession was not allowed by the Constitution. And this is something that historian Brenda Wineapple says is like claiming murder can't happen because it's against the law. But that's how Johnson viewed secession, as legally never having happened, and thus he champions what he called presidential reconstruction. He would do it, as opposed to congressional reconstruction. Conflict between the president and the Republican Congress flared by December of 1865 and would culminate with the impeachment of Johnson in February 1868. Along the way, Johnson vetoed all legislation intended to help the freed people, though many of those votes were overridden by the Republicans as they moved forward with Reconstruction. The Republicans publicly turned against Johnson late 1865. Douglass and other African Americans turned against him more quickly. In a lecture in Boston in the fall of 1865, Douglass warned, quote, that the gains of the Civil War were on the verge of being lost because of the imbecility or the treachery of President Johnson, end quote. Douglass was also concerned that the Republicans weren't pushing hard enough for Black citizenship and that something needed to be done. That takes us to Douglass's second encounter with Andrew Johnson on February 7th, 1866. At a Black convention in Boston just a few months earlier, Douglass proposed that a Black delegation should go to Washington to lobby for the full rights of citizenship for African Americans. The convention approved the resolution, and the group, which included Douglass, arrived in Washington, D.C. late January of 1866. Johnson was willing to meet with the delegation because he thought it would be good publicity, and he brought along a stenographer named James Clephane, who had recently pioneered a new form of shorthand. Clephane's transcript of the meeting appeared in a Washington newspaper that very evening. It then went viral, as we would say, appearing in newspapers across the country. The meeting did not go as well as Johnson had hoped. In fact, it embarrassed him. The nominal leader of the group was George T. Downing, a Black activist and caterer, and a friend of Charles Sumner, who had got him the job of running the congressional cafeteria. The secretary of the group was Lewis Henry Douglass, the Douglasses' eldest son. Downing began the meeting by telling Johnson they were there to talk about Black suffrage. Johnson cut off any hope for an actual conversation by launching into a speech, which Douglass later said in his 1881 autobiography went on for hours, and he was exaggerating. Eventually, some in the group interrupted Johnson with questions, which made Johnson defensive. So what does he do when he's defensive? He brings up his status as a Moses for Black people. So this is from the newspaper transcript, which is all, it's an amazing transcript, and it's all from Johnson's own person, who kept this record. As Johnson asserted to the delegation, quote, "I have said, and I will repeat here, that if the colored man in the United States could find no other Moses or any Moses that would be more able and efficient than myself, I would be his Moses to lead him from bondage to freedom," unquote. That comment seemed to end the discussion. There was an exchange of thank yous and goodbyes as the group headed for the door. But just as the Black delegation was about to go through that door, Douglass turned to the president and said, quote, "If the president will allow me, I would like to say one or two words. You enfranchise your enemies and disenfranchise your friends," end quote. In other words, Johnson was helping the ex-Confederates, who were once his enemies, while scorning the Blacks, his friends who had fought in the Union Army. This accusation infuriated Johnson, and the meeting became a back and forth between Douglass and Johnson, all captured by the stenographer, and it's all in my favorite chapter in the book, way back there, in which Douglass goaded Johnson, getting him angrier and angrier so that Johnson would expose the full extent of his racism and resistance to a Reconstruction that would empower African Americans. Eventually, Johnson declared that Blacks should consider immigration. When Black activists read the transcript of the meeting, which was reprinted among other places in such Black newspapers as the Christian Recorder, that's the AME Journal, they were outraged. This was a Moses for Black people? The meeting had got away from Johnson. He expressed his frustration to his aides shortly after the delegation departed, and one of those aides shared Johnson's private comments with a newspaper editor who refused to print them because he supported Johnson and didn't want to embarrass him. But the letter survives in manuscript. As reported in the letter, Johnson declared to his aides, quote, "Those damn sons of bitches thought they had me in a trap. I know that damn Douglass. He's just like any," then he uses the N-word, "and he would soon cut a white man's throat than not," end quote. Meanwhile, the Black delegation quickly crafted a response to what Johnson had to say to them at the meeting. The response appeared in the next day's Washington, D.C. newspaper as a frame to a corrected, proofread transcript of the meeting. Douglass and this group had media savvy. In his 1881 autobiography, Douglass described the meeting as a turning point for the way it exposed Johnson's racism and further undercut his support. That spring and summer of 1866 saw massacres of over 100 Blacks in Memphis and New Orleans, violence that Douglass and others, including many of the radical Republicans, believed was encouraged by Johnson's racism and his refusal to support Black suffrage. I particularly like this Thomas Nast 1867 painting of the New Orleans massacre of late July 1866, which led to the deaths of approximately 40 African Americans. Here, Johnson, depicted as someone who regards himself as a king, you can see the crown, watches from a shed inscribed with a sentence from his Moses speech, and it's probably hard to see, you'll have to trust me, but at the top of that shed it says, "I am your Moses." Right around the time of this massacre, Douglass remarked in a speech that the man, quote, who promised to be the Moses of the colored race had become their Pharaoh instead. Speaking of 1867, this is a well-known photograph of Douglass made by Cincinnati's famous Black photographer, J.P. Presley. Douglass used this image on a visiting card. Douglass was obsessed with the new technology of photography, which he regarded as a democratic art, and also as a way to counter whites' racist stereotypes of the so-called bestial African-American man. Some have argued that Douglass was the most photographed man in 19th century America. And if you're interested in pictures of Douglass, this book has every known picture of Douglass up to 2015. And in the subtitle, they refer to Douglass as the most photographed man in 19th century America. Mark Twain might be up there, but he crosses into the 20th century too. And Lincoln would have been had he not been assassinated. But let's return to Douglass and Johnson. In December 1866 and January 1867, Douglass published anti-Johnson essays in the prestigious magazine, The Atlantic Monthly. Starting in December 1866 and through most of 1867, Douglass delivered various versions of a great anti-Johnson speech called Sources of Danger to the Republic. In the speech, which he delivered in Philadelphia and elsewhere, Douglass argued that the principal source of danger to the Republic was the Constitution's failure to offer proper checks on the presidency. As elaborated in the speech, Douglass was troubled by the president's veto power, pardoning power, and access to patronage. All of this was much to the chagrin of Johnson, who got regular reports about Douglass's speeches from his friends and advisors. So we're now in the summer of 1867, less than a year before the Republicans presented their articles of impeachment, and Johnson was beginning to feel desperate about trying to regain support from at least some of the Republicans. So what did he do? He offered Douglass a job in his administration as commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau. Perhaps he thought this would shut Douglass up. Johnson did this through back channels because he didn't want to be publicly embarrassed if Douglass refused the job. Douglass thwarted Johnson by declining the job in a letter published September 1867 in a New York newspaper. The editor of that paper introduced the letter by saying, quote, "The greatest Black man in the nation did not consent to become the tool of the meanest white. For this prudence and firmness, Mr. Douglass is entitled to the thanks of the country," end quote. We now come to the controversy that precipitated the February 1868 impeachment. By late 1867, Johnson wanted to fire Edwin M. Stanton, who was the Secretary of War under Lincoln and then under Johnson. Johnson thought Stanton was overly sympathetic to the radical Republicans, but such a firing at the time would have been an illegal and even an impeachable offense under the Tenure of Office Act, passed by the Republican Congress earlier in 1867. And I'm no constitutional historian. I'm just going to kind of give you a kind of a big picture of what's going on here. So These are some quotes from the Tenure of Office Act, passed in March 1867. The Supreme Court later, about 20 years later, ruled it unconstitutional. There's two key sections that are relevant to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. So section 1, every person holding any civil office to which he has been appointed by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, and that would be Stanton, shall be entitled to hold such office until a successor shall have been in like manner appointed and duly qualified. And again, Stanton had been appointed by the Senate, so he has to be fired by the Senate, and someone else has to be appointed by the Senate. According to this, Section 6 stipulates that violations of the Tenure of Office Act would be regarded as high misdemeanors and therefore as impeachable. Why did the Republicans pass such an act? I think they saw it as a pragmatic way of possibly getting rid of Johnson without exposing the Republicans to the charge that they were a black party, something they feared would lose them votes from their white constituents. In February 1868, Johnson asked Ulysses S. Grant, general of the U.S. Army, to fire Stanton. When Grant refused because of the Tenure of Office Act, and there's an interesting exchange you can find in the Johnson papers, in which Grant says to Johnson, "You paid the $5,000 fine." There was also a fine, and he wouldn't. So he says no. When Grant refused because of the Tenure of Office Act, Johnson went ahead and did the deed himself. So here's a picture of Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War, 1862, 1868. The Republicans' response to the firing of Stanton was predictable. They were overjoyed, and they quickly formulated 11 articles of impeachment, all of which focused on the Tenure of Office Act. Stanton himself refused to accept the firing and hid out in his office for several months to see what would happen. And I find that really odd, but apparently he really did lock the door of his office. And my theory is that that person Downing, who was at that meeting with Johnson, who was also the caterer for Congress, was bringing him food. Otherwise, he would have starved. And he died. You could see the pressure of this, I think, led to his death. Meanwhile, Douglass and other Black activists had absolutely no interest in the Tenure of Office Act. They wanted Johnson impeached and convicted for his racist resistance to Reconstruction, which they believed had contributed to hundreds, if not thousands, of deaths of African Americans. They thought the trial itself should have been about something other than what one African American newspaper termed, quote, legal quibbles, end quote. It's worth emphasizing that there were no Black voices as part of the trial. There were a few moments when the House managers of the impeachment talked about Johnson as someone who had done terrible harm to the free people. But the trial was mainly about what Johnson had done to a white man named Edward Stanton. Virtually all newspaper reports spoke to the tedium of the debates on whether the Tenure of Office Act had been violated. This is a famous illustration from Harper's Weekly. The Senate as a court of impeachment. You get a sense that this was really good theater. What you can't see is how bored a lot of these people are in that image. And you can go online and get the complete transcript of the trial. It is incredibly boring to read, but I read it while on salary and writing this book, so it's okay. Because it's all legal quibbles. Douglass wanted Johnson convicted and removed from office, but he remained on the sidelines during the trial. There were at least 3 reasons for Douglass's decision to keep his distance. First, he was frustrated that the trial wasn't focused on the big issues central to Reconstruction, such as Johnson's resistance to Black suffrage. Second, he didn't want his status as a celebrity Black man to distract from the proceedings. Third, he had his son, Charles Ramon Douglas, in Washington, D.C., and on occasion at the trial itself as a conduit. Charles Ramon Douglas was Anna and Douglas's 3rd son, and he had a job at the Freedmen's Bureau in Washington, D.C. In letters that are now housed in the Library of Congress, and which were a great resource for me, Charles reported to his father on what was happening with the impeachment proceedings. Charles's position was clear. He had no interest in the Tenure of Office Act, and he wanted Johnson convicted as a failed Reconstruction president. But that didn't happen. There were votes on 2 of the 11 articles of impeachment in May 1868. Both fell short of conviction by 1 vote, and the Republicans decided to end the trial. Douglass, his son, and many other Blacks felt betrayed. Historians have speculated that the Republicans didn't want Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio, a Republican, to become president. There was no vice president at the time, and as president pro tempore of the U.S. Senate, Wade was next in line. And Republicans lamented Wade had socialist leanings. The Republicans instead wanted the popular Ulysses S. Grant as president, which could only happen through a general election. Grant did become president around 8 months later. Grant hated and fought the Ku Klux Klan, and yet during the 1870s, Reconstruction increasingly failed under his watch. From the point of view of Douglass's 2 sons, George P. Downing, and other African Americans, the impeachment proceedings, with its focus on the Tenure of Office Act, had revealed the Republicans' reluctance to confront Johnson's racist resistance to Reconstruction head on. But Douglass did not publicly criticize the Republicans. Instead, he went after Salmon Chase, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, who presided over the impeachment trial. According to Douglass and a number of Republican leaders, Chase did everything he could to keep the proceedings focused on the Tenure of Office Act instead of on Johnson's harmful actions toward Black Americans, which did come up occasionally during the proceedings, only to be shut down by Chase. Chase was a former abolitionist and friend of Douglass who was angling for the presidential nomination from the anti-Reconstruction Democratic Party, knowing that Grant would get the Republican nomination. And Chase is an interesting character. It seemed he was just motivated always to want to become president. And that's why Lincoln put him on the Supreme Court, to get him, away from the possibility that he would run against Lincoln. Douglass and his son Charles both thought that Chase favored Johnson, and they were furious that Chase, once a friend of Douglass's, had appeared to let his presidential ambitions override what had once been his moral convictions. So these are snippets of what Douglass and his son Charles had to say about Chase. Charles, in a May 29, 1868 letter to his father, quote, "I am not for any man who would help to secure the acquittal of Andrew Johnson," end quote. And here he's talking about Chase as a possible candidate for the presidency. And Frederick Douglass, in an essay published 2 months after the acquittal of Johnson, wrote that Chase's courtship of the Democratic Party was, quote, "certainly one of the saddest spectacles which could afflict the eyes of men," end quote. Chase's failed machinations, Douglass concluded, had led him to the gutter. And that's Douglass's word. It's a vitriolic piece. But as angry as Douglass was at Chase, the Chief Justice arguably was doing his job, given how the Republicans had framed the articles of impeachment. Johnson had been impeached but not convicted. He served out his term to early 1869. Meanwhile, the radical Republicans had undercut Johnson's presidential power, and in 1868, the year of Johnson's acquittal, they oversaw the ratification of the 14th Amendment, granting birthright citizenship and equal protection under the law to African Americans. 2 years later, in 1870, Douglass celebrated what he regarded as the greatest triumph of all, the ratification of the 15th Amendment, giving Black men the same right to vote as white men, even as he continued to support women's right to vote. And Douglass was actually at the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention for women's rights. You can detect Douglas's excitement about the amendment, the 15th Amendment, in this letter to friends in Rochester that was printed in an April 1870 issue of the New York Times. Douglas proclaimed, "The revolution wrought in our condition by the 15th Amendment, by the Constitution to the United States, is almost startling, even to me. I view it with something like amazement. It is truly vast and wonderful. And when we think through what labors, tears, treasures, and precious blood it has come, we may well contemplate it with solemn joy. Henceforth, we live in a new world." Had Reconstruction, so that's the end of the quote, had Reconstruction ended with the successful implementation of the Reconstruction Amendments, I would conclude my talk here, but that was not to be the case. True, slavery was ended by the 13th Amendment, but equal protection under the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment and black male suffrage guaranteed by the 15th were increasingly threatened after 1870. Douglas took note of these developments in a number of speeches, culminating in the 1894 Lessons of the Hour. So I'm going to move quickly from the 1870s to 1894. Johnson, who had come to be vilified in the late 1860s, returned to his home state of Tennessee. In 1875, he was appointed by the Tennessee State Legislature as one of the state's 2 senators, and senators back then were not popularly elected. But Johnson died just a few months into his term as senator. As this popular Courier and Ives print of Johnson on his deathbed suggests, Johnson was mourned by many as a former president. But Douglas remained angry at the former president for everything he represented, and he regularly linked Johnson to what he soon regarded as the failed promise of Reconstruction. In 1880, 5 years after Johnson's death and 12 years after the verdict that allowed Johnson to stay in office for another half year, Douglas had particularly harsh things to say about the now dead Andrew Johnson. Here's just what Douglas, some nice images from the Library of Congress, 2 negatives of Douglas in 1880. And this is what Douglas said about Johnson in 1880. Andrew Johnson, the Moses of the colored race. And I have to reveal to you that my wife once said, as she was kind of reading through the book as I was writing it, if I have to hear the word Moses one more time. Anyway, Andrew Johnson, the Moses of the colored race, had betrayed that race into the blood-stained hands of the old master class. He had betrayed the Republican Party by which he had been elected when he was plotting the organization of a new party upon its ruins, when he was seeking the destruction of the Freedmen's Bureau, when outrage, riot, and murder held sway in the South, end quote. Johnson was no Moses. One could argue, perhaps incorrectly, that the Republicans' failure to make the case against Johnson in Douglas's terms contributed to the failure of Reconstruction because it allowed Americans to avoid confronting the racial issues at the center of the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the nation's longer history. And Reconstruction did fail. By the late 1870s, the voting rights for African Americans secured by the 15th Amendment had effectively been nullified by anti-Black violence, particularly in the South. It became extremely difficult and in many places nearly impossible for Blacks to vote in the Jim Crow South until the 1960s. From Douglas's perspective, the Supreme Court in 1883 contributed to that failure by overturning the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which had attempted to shore up the 14th Amendment's granting of birthright citizenship to African Americans. So from Douglas's perspective, the Supreme Court had effectively made the 14th and 15th Amendments null and void. As he wrote in his 1892 version of Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, quote, "The future historian will turn to the year 1883 to find the most flagrant example of this national deterioration. Here he will find the Supreme Court of the nation reversing the action of the government, defeating the manifest purpose of the Constitution, nullifying the 14th Amendment, and placing itself on the side of prejudice, proscription, and persecution," end quote. As Douglass pretty much predicted in his response to this ruling, the Southern states in particular would see an upsurge of anti-Black persecution, most horrifyingly in the form of lynching, which is to say the extra-legal killing of Blacks, mostly men, by guns, knives, flames, and hanging. Over 1,400 African Americans were lynched during the 1890s, and lynchings would continue well into the 20th century. During the 1880s and 1890s, the African-American journalist and activist Ida B. Wells, who was based in Memphis, emerged as the leading chronicler and critic of lynching, with her major work being Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, published in 1892. Douglass's anti-lynching speech, Lessons of the Hour, which is one of his greatest speeches, owes a good deal to the cultural work of Ida B. Wells. Douglass gave the speech in 1894, and I can't resist sharing this wonderful image, very studied posed image of Douglass in 1894 at Cedar Hill, his Anacostia mansion overlooking Capitol Hill. We don't see his face, we see a man surrounded by his books, hard at work in old age. In the speech itself, which Douglass delivered to an enthusiastic audience at Washington's Metropolitan AME Church, Douglass challenged the running narrative that Black men were being lynched because they had sexually violated white women. He said that if you want to know something about sexual violation, look at the history of the slave plantation, where white masters had regularly raped Black women, as Douglass's mixed race identity would attest. He argued that whites involved with lynching were projecting their guilt about that history onto Black men. Douglass gets to the nub of the matter in the two passages I put on the slide. As he makes clear, there simply is no way putting a bright gloss on the current situation. Douglass bluntly states, quote, "There is nothing in the history of savages to surpass the blood-chilling horrors and fiendish excesses perpetrated against the colored people," end quote. The use of the word savages is deliberate here, as this is the term that was regularly used to describe the Black men who were being lynched as alleged rapists. Douglass goes on to argue that lynchings were part of a continued strategy to deny Blacks the vote and in this way undo the 15th Amendment. As he remarks, "I have no confidence in the truthfulness of men who justify themselves in cheating the Negro out of his constitutional right to vote," end quote. If Douglass were alive today, I'm sure he'd have much to say about legislative initiatives that seem calculated to cut back on Black voting. He would also no doubt have much to say about efforts to cut back on the teaching of Black history, specifically the history of slavery and racism. He would hardly be pleased, for example, that his most famous speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," can no longer be taught to high schoolers in Texas. But he would also remind us of American ideals and possibilities. Even in the 1894 Lessons of the Hour, in which everything he had fought for during the Johnson administration seemed to be in jeopardy, Douglass never gave up hope, and that is one of the many reasons I've loved working on Douglass over the past 30 years. His indomitable spirit of hope. Consider the way he concludes a speech that is mainly about horrific violence done to the Black body. And these are the closing words of Lessons of the Hour, which will come close to being my closing words. "Put away your race prejudice. Banish the idea that one class must rule over another. Recognize the fact that the rights of the humblest citizen are as worthy of protection as those of the highest, and your problems will be solved. And whatever may be in store for it in the future, whether prosperity or adversity, whether it shall have foes without or foes within, whether there shall be peace or war, based upon the eternal principles of truth, justice, and humanity, and with no class having any cause of complaint or grievance, your republic will stand and flourish forever." Douglass may have lamented the failed promise of Reconstruction, but in the Declaration of Independence and other founding documents, he continued to see promise in the United States for the achievement someday of a multiracial democracy. He dreamed of your republic becoming our republic. His words and deeds continue to inspire. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Levine. We do have time for a few questions. We have Mr. Mundy in the back. Jim, I think we have a question right back there.
Thank you very much for an enjoyable lecture. Johnson's premise that the southern states had never actually seceded, was that ever adjudicated? Did a court ever consider whether?
I would say no, not at all. But it's his ongoing position. I think it's fascinating that he took that position, and I like the Brenda Whiteapple quote or statement about you can't murder because it's against the law. I mean, it's a funny quote, and I like to use it. It's usually when I give a lecture, it's the first time people laugh when I quote from another historian. But I think in important ways, it speaks to where he was coming from as someone from Tennessee, and maybe he saw himself as a leader of Tennessee and a representative Southern leader who never fully bought into that secession. But in point of fact, I think he was the only Southern senator who was not approving of secession.
Other questions? Oh, Jim, how about?
Again, thank you for very informational talk. What is your thinking about what Douglass would think about the movement about reparations today, particularly in the context of 350,000 mortalities by the North in a war that he perceived to be a war to abolish slavery?
So I'm not sure I got the entire question. So question about Douglass.
Basically reparations. I mean, is this something that, based upon your knowledge of Douglass and his thinking, would he support or would he not support the movement towards reparations towards African-American citizens?
So I think that's a great question. Reparations, I think, are really tricky. Plus, I think it's really tricky to imagine what Douglass would think right now. So I kind of want to sidestep the question because I don't see any evidence that he wanted reparations. And one of the speeches that he gave that I know has been embraced by more conservative libertarian people, because I was asked to come to a seminar to talk about this, is a speech in which Douglass says, leave the black man alone. And people love that, but it's also like, leave the black man alone, let the black man vote, leave the black man alone, don't lynch the black man. But I don't think he was asking, I don't see any evidence that he would support a reparation movement. But I think then we get into this kind of gray, tricky area, maybe depending on one's politics almost, about how Douglass would respond right now to things going on in Georgia or Texas or Florida in particular. And it's my sense that he wouldn't like, for example, the state government in Texas deciding that the elected election commission in Houston cannot serve any longer, and that voting boxes shouldn't be available any longer, so that people are going to have to wait 3 to 4 hours to vote instead of the 5 minutes that I have to wait when I vote in my suburban terrain. So I think that that's something he might get engaged with. I'm not sure about reparations at all. And I don't see how reparations could even work. So that's my position.
So thank you so much for a great talk tonight. I'm just wondering, it seems like Johnson really changes his position when he becomes president. You suggest that before he becomes president, he actually had some pretty progressive ideas about race,
Right.
and there's evidence of that. And yet then he becomes president and we see a very different position, which has huge impact
Right.
for several years. So can you explain what happens with him in that change of position there?
Yeah, I can handle that one. Reparations, forget. In the reviews of my book, that's for sale for $15. People refer to my nuanced treatment of Johnson. And so it's more nuanced in the book than in the talk. Couple of things I bring out of the book. First of all, Lincoln is hesitant about giving Blacks the right to vote. And there is a speech he gives just before he's assassinated where it seems like he's kind of suggesting maybe the intelligent Black person could vote. And also maybe the Black who served in the Union Army can vote. But it's very tentative. But apparently John Wilkes Booth heard this speech and was furious. So he saw it as something more. So if you're Eric Foner, you say, oh yeah, Lincoln was going to be great. He was going to let Black people vote. Okay, so then we get to Andrew Johnson, and this is more developed in the book. He tells these Republican senators that he's with them on the 14th and 15th Amendment, particularly on the right to vote. He doesn't immediately change his mind. So what he does do is he gives this amnesty proclamation that seems to give all the power to the Southern states if they sign on to the 13th Amendment, which they have to do anyway. He then writes to a governor in Mississippi and says, maybe you should allow Blacks to vote. The intelligent Black. It is always qualified. And that letter has been covered up, but it's in the Johnson papers. And he writes that in late 1865. So the more subtle argument could be that that Lincoln and Johnson are pretty close. Okay. Then, and I can kind of understand this because I'm a confrontationalist kind of person myself. When the radical Republicans come at him, I think he becomes the Southern, more of a Southerner, and he's resistant. He doesn't want these Massachusetts people like myself telling him what to do. So I think that there's a kind of personality issue as well, a political issue. And the other thing is that Johnson, another argument I make in the book, Johnson was not rich and worked as a tailor. He eventually got into real estate. And one could argue that when he becomes president, he likes the idea that the rich Southerners who scorned him are now coming to him for amnesty, and that he then becomes part of that community as, at the top rather than below. The other argument that a whole bunch of people make is he hated Black people. But I don't think his racism is all that different from some of the other whites of the time. This is something I also talk about is Thaddeus Stevens, who was a radical Republican arguing for Blacks' rights to vote. There's letters he wrote his wife over a 20-year period in which he says, I don't want food cooked for me by a Black person. I don't want Black fingers in that food. This is the great, emancipator. So it's very complicated. There's racism everywhere. But Johnson, so I would say the more subtle argument is Johnson and Lincoln are kind of close in 1865. And then you get into this kind of political war with the Northern radical Republicans, in which he suddenly is saying no.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Professor Robert Levine. Professor, thank you so much. There are books, as was mentioned. They are $15 a piece. They make a great Hanukkah gift, a great Christmas gift. So please go back and get the professor to sign one of his great books. Thank you. Have a wonderful holiday.